All right, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. I am LeftToeDjinn, and today I am coming to you with some of my original stories because somebody redeemed a reading stream on the games that I normally play. So, hopefully everybody's having a good time. I know it's a lot earlier than I usually stream, but I figured since most of my viewers were in the UK or Europe or actually even further away than that in the way of time zones, might as well do an earlier stream, get somebody, some nice bedtime stories, and by nice I mean horrific and, nightmare inducing. It's fine. Uh okay. So, without further ado, I'm going to start. You can see here we have the illustration for this, which was originally in Tales in Somber Tones. Now, the artwork for that and most of the artwork for the stories I'm going to be presenting today were done by Karen Ruffles of Drawing in Dark. You can do exclamation point art for that. If you're looking for information about buying copies of the book, please do exclamation point book in the chat. Chat. That's a good way to start a reading stream, isn't it? I like it. Um, but yeah, the first story I'm going to be reading to you is called Charmed. The sun was low in the hills, hanging in clouds of orange and pink and a blood-red sky. Their bags still lay scattered on the living room floor, being unpacked one piece at a time as they require things from their trip. Neither of them had gone back to work after returning from their vacation. They had called in every outstanding sick day, every floating holiday, and they had to prevent losing their jobs, but they'd given up returning the phone calls and urgent texts. There just didn't seem to be much point in it all anymore. Claire and Anthony spooned on the sofa, watching an unfortunate infomercial on a new and improved way to cook fish. Neither of them knew where the remote was. People have been eating fish for millions of years, Claire said. You think we'd know how by now? Anthony didn't reply. He simply lay there, unblinking, stroking Claire's hair, remembering the trip they had taken. Do you want to get something delivered soon? Claire asked, elbowing him in the side. Anthony grunted in a semi-positive tone. Anthony? Claire rolled over and burrowed her head into his chest. Do you still hear the voices? Their vacation was a long time coming. They were both professionals. They wore suits and worked in offices where how well you bantered with your coworkers was just as important as your ability to do your job, and they both wanted to go someplace where they didn't speak the language, but where they could be pampered. They settled, after very little research, on an area of Egypt far away from the more well-known ruins, but that still had highly recommended hotels and restaurants. They were deeply disappointed that most of the staff, the cabbies, the servers and hosts, and several people who were vending items in the streets all spoke English. At least we won't have trouble in an emergency, Anthony said. Claire rolled her eyes. They had been on vacation for 3 days. The shops and restaurants nearby to their hotel had lost their allure, and they had spent the day exploring further areas on foot, trying to find something interesting to take home with them. Claire had found a vendor of spices and dried fruits, and was neck-deep in negotiation with an irritated shop owner over the price. So Anthony took his leave of her and went across the street to a cellar of oddities and souvenirs. He looked over the compressed sand sculptures of the pyramids, the plastic recreations of reed ships and bobblehead figures of palm trees with sunglasses, groaning internally. He nodded politely to the vendor. Sorry to be a pest, he started, but I don't suppose you have anything a little different for sale. The vendor stared at him for a moment, then smiled. Sir would like something special to take home with him, he asked, winking as obviously as he could. Oh? Oh, no, nothing like that, Anthony flustered, holding up his hands in innocence. I'm just looking for something a little more unique than these. The vendor nodded in understanding. I have a few things you might like, he said, and pulled out a small tray of items from below the counter. Anthony looked over the pieces in the tray, the vendor describing them as he went. There were bracelets made by local craftspeople using local materials, some rings and pendants of silver and gold, and then there was a collection of things which were very obviously not local. What are those? Anthony asked. Well, you see, Egypt is very old. We were trading throughout the Mediterranean and all along the coast of Europe and Africa before Troy fell and spawned the refugees who formed Rome. And in all that time, we have collected things from other places, he explained, indicating the jade tiles and ancient coins from places Anthony had never heard of. He spotted a small figure in the pile, scarcely an inch tall, made of a strange dark stone that had, at some point, been tumbled and chipped among the stones or in the sea. Where did this come from? He asked. The vendor examined the figure, running his fingers over the deeply carved lines, making out the body of a cat in a sitting position, noting the oddly rounded face and deep holes left there. They gave Anthony the impression that it was watching the both of them in shocked interest. I don't know, sir, the vendor admitted. It could be one of ours, but it could just as easily have come from somewhere else. You think so? The vendor smiled. It's a cat, sir. People like cats. Anthony laughed and bought the figure. The vendor put it in a small velvet bag, and Anthony put the bag in his pocket. He made it back to his wife just in time to see the end of the negotiations, which settled on a price just a little more than the shop owner had originally quoted. They did, finally, move from the sofa, if only because it was more comfortable to spend the night in their bed. But neither of them slept. They lay there, motionless, barely even breathing, hands resting against one another for the reassurance touch brings. They would be out of money in 2 weeks. Every drop of savings would be gone, every hiding spot for cash raided. Anthony tried to do the math in his head and was surprised to find that he didn't care. Yes, rent was coming due. Yes, food was getting scarce. But none of that mattered anymore. Anthony wondered if, perhaps, it never did. That night, Claire and Anthony ate dinner at a fantastic place about a mile from their hotel. The food was vegetarian, and it was absolutely delicious. Anthony reached into his pocket to pay for their meal and pulled out the little velvet bag along with his money. What's that? Claire asked, reaching for the bag. Anthony quickly snatched it away from her. Nothing, just something I picked up earlier. She glared at him in mock outrage. Are you buying weird shit again? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Did you find a monkey's paw, a cursed lamp? She reached for the bag again, and Anthony pulled it away, laughing. You know, we have ways of making you talk, she said in a bad German accent. Torture? He smiled back. Of a sort, she smiled as well. They both erupted in laughter, drawing pleasant looks from the other diners. It's just an old figure, Anthony admitted, dumping it out of the bag and into his hand. Barely worth mentioning. He stared at the figure in his hand for several seconds, looking into the hollow eyes, stroking the rough stone. Somewhere on the edge of hearing, something called his name. Claire poked him in the side. Anthony, she called, moving his face in front of hers. Did you stroke out there for a second? Anthony shook his head. Sorry, I was miles away. He stood up and put the figure back in his pocket. Do you want to head back to the hotel? He asked. I'm kind of tired all of a sudden. The rest of the evening passed pleasantly. They put a movie on their tablet and fell asleep in each other's arms. It was still dark when Claire awoke alone in the hotel bed. She could hear something coming from across the room. A kind of halting, staggered whisper. Anthony? She called, but the whisper kept on. She turned on the bedside lamp and saw Anthony, nude, squatted down in the corner, whispering into his fists that he held clasped together in front of him. She went to him and gently laid her hand on his shoulder. He jerked back, beads of sweat flinging from his face. His eyes were wide and wild and mad. He pulled Claire down to the floor and hissed, "Do you hear it?" What? Do you hear it?" Anthony shouted, then whispered, "It won't be quiet. It keeps talking, telling me things. Things I don't want to know. Things I shouldn't know." He opened his fist and held out his hand to her. There, in his palm, lay the small cat-like figure she'd seen at dinner. "Listen," Anthony breathed, holding the figure up to Claire's ear. She tried to push his hand away, but it was already too late. She no longer wanted to. Claire opened her eyes. There was a stench in the air, much more repulsive than her own unwashed body. She looked over at Anthony and saw what it was. She couldn't tell how long he'd been dead, but it was long enough for rot to set in. She gathered together what strength she had left and sat up. When was the last time I ate? She thought. She couldn't remember. Her memories were cloudy, unorganized. Nothing seemed to make sense. She stood up, slowly, unsteadily, and shuffled down the hallway to the living room. She fell to her knees next to Anthony's luggage and felt a bone snap like a dry stick. She paid it no mind. After all, it didn't really matter. She dug through his suitcase until she found a small velvet bag. She pulled the tiny figure from the bag and held it to her ear. She closed her eyes and breathed deep. And she listened. Alright, so that was Charmed. Hopefully you guys like that. We're going to keep going with To Spite the Living. Just going to change the image here. I love this illustration, by the way. This is a original artwork done by Drawing in Dark, and I don't know to this day how she managed to get carbon and charcoal layered, and two of the layers are semi-transparent. I don't know how she did it. I'm impressed regardless. So this one is To Spite the Living. It was an unseasonably warm day in the north of England. People flocked to the streets and stores in t-shirts and trousers. Some of them put on their spring dresses, even though it was only February, and moved about in crowds like spots of light in a gray world. The churchyard, by contrast, was quiet and calm. William had always loved old churchyards. It was something about the look, desolation kept with care, that struck a chord with him. All across the United Kingdom, he had visited old churchyards and ruins, sat in them a while, explored the grounds, and, if at all possible, took souvenirs home with him. He was not a grave robber. At least, he never thought of himself as a grave robber, although he had collected the odd bit of bone or piece of statue from time to time while on his adventures. A finger joint here, a bit of rib there. Things so small as to not be missed unless you were looking for them. And if he had to pay the occasional caretaker a little extra for them, so be it. He was a collector, and hobbies cost money. William paced back and forth along a row of ancient headstones. The names, once cut so deeply into them, were now shallow and hard to read among the dried moss and lichen. His contact was late. He had been waiting for over an hour, trying to be as inconspicuous as possible, pacing, and was quickly getting fed up. He kicked at a stone in the grass and sent it flying into a tombstone, where it hit with a hollow, light sound. Curious, he went over to it, looked around, then bent over to pick it up. What he had kicked turned out not to be a rock at all, but an old, thin bit of bone. He inspected it closely, but try as he might, he could not identify its origin. Someone behind him coughed, and he spun around while holding his new treasure out of sight. Sitting on a wide tomb a few rows back from the older graves sat a woman in a simple dress, her leg over her knee, smiling at him. "I'd put that back, if I were you," she said, no malice at all in her tone. "Put what back?" William replied, playing dumb. "Well, darling," the woman started, tilting her head to one side. "If you can't sort that out for yourself, then I really can't help you." William stared at her for several seconds, trying his best not to show the rising panic he felt. The woman never stopped smiling at him, as if she were having a private joke. Finally, William cleared his throat. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. I have nothing," he said, then put the piece of bone in his pocket and walked away. As he was passing through the churchyard gate, he thought he heard laughter from a long way off, but when he turned around, the woman was gone. It was a several-hour drive back to his home, and night had fallen by the time William stepped through the door. He took his new prize out of his pocket and placed it on the dining room table, looking at it in the light. He wondered if it might be an animal bone of some kind. "Look who's talking, ape!" a voice called out. William nearly jumped out of his skin. He ran through the house with a fire poker in his hand, trying to locate the intruder. He looked everywhere, but he was alone. He sat down at the table once again, sweating from fear and surprise, thinking he had imagined the voice he heard. "You're not that clever," the voice announced. "Who's there?" William shouted, poker at the ready. A deep, throaty laughter was all that replied. William sat in silence for several minutes, trying his best not to freak out. "Am I going mad?" he thought. "You're already mad, Willie. You steal bones for fun, you daft bastard." The voice was confident, amused. "How do you know my name?" William asked. "Well, it's all over your mail," replied the voice. William swallowed in a dry throat. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Oh, a game! It's been so long since I've had a game. All right, you guess, and I'll tell you if you're warm or cold." "What?" "You want to know where I am? These are my terms." William stood up, keeping his makeshift weapon with him, and peered into the kitchen. "Oh, cold, Willie. Ice cold. Antarctic." William growled under his breath. He hated being called Willie. He made his way down the hallway and toward his bedroom. "You're on Pluto now," the voice called out, but was no quieter. William went into the bathroom and used the poker to open the shower curtain. "Honestly, Ape, it's like you're not even trying." "This is a ridiculous game," William shouted. "If you had asked me my name, we could be playing charades," the voice replied. William rolled his eyes and went back to the dining room table. "This prank isn't funny," he announced. "Warmer," teased the voice. William frowned, then peered under the table. The voice started laughing. "You're really bad at this," it said. "You tell me where you are, you bastard!" The voice was silent for a moment, then said, "I am exactly where you put me." "Excuse me?" "By all the veil, you are thick, aren't you? Honestly, Willie, no wonder you live alone." William's eyes dropped to the table, and a piece of bone sitting there. "By the gods! Realization finally dawns for the idiot," the voice teased, laughing. William shook his head. "I'm calling the police," he said, getting out his cell phone. "Oh, yes, that'll go so very well." "Hello, police," the voice mocked. "There's a bone I stole from a churchyard, and it won't stop pointing out that I'm an absolute git. That's bound to work. I'll wait for them to come to drag me away then, shall I?" William paused, then hung up the phone. What do you want? The voice laughed in delight. We get to play charades after all! William sat, unmoved, and didn't reply. Aw. Are we no longer playing, Willie? The voice goaded. You might be, but I'm not. This is absurd. Says the man who collects old calcium deposits. Obviously a font of sanity you are. A lot of people have hobbies, William shouted at the bone fragment. He couldn't see it, but William had the distinct impression that, should the bone fragment have had eyes, it would have rolled them. The voice sighed. You're almost too easy, it said. What game shall we play now? I told you, William replied. I'm not playing. Are you a betting man, William? What? Do you gamble, take chances, risk losing something in order to gain something more? What does that have to do with anything? William growled. Look, when a sentient piece of bone that's sitting on your table asks you a question, you bloody well humor it. Got it? I don't have to. This might not even be happening. Oh, you mean you might be asleep? The voice asked, a dangerous edge to its voice. Yeah, or hallucinating or something. William sat back, exasperated. There was silence for a moment. Then, you're right, the voice said. You might be dreaming. You should wake up. William woke up just as the car went over the edge of the cliff, bursting through the guardrail without even slowing down. He was weightless, hitting his head on the roof of his car as he sailed downward towards the churning ocean and jagged, unforgiving rocks. He screamed. He was back at his table once more. The voice was laughing. Are you awake now? It asked, amused. That doesn't prove anything, William shouted. The voice sighed, and then William punched himself in the groin. He shouted in surprise at the altogether alien feeling of losing control of his own limbs. Through the haze of pain, he heard a voice ask, And how about now? Still dreaming? What the hell was that? William screamed. What? William flung his own shin into the table leg. That? Are you really that thick? How are you doing that? We possess certain powers, Ape, even in death. Controlling weak-willed individuals is hardly a challenge. We? The voice chuckled. Dragons, it said. Dragons don't exist, William said. His hand jumped up and grabbed hold of the top of his own ear. Do you know how much force it takes to remove a human ear? The dragon asked. Only a few pounds. Normally, the pain keeps you from even getting close to that point. Your body simply won't let you. However, since I can't feel it, William screamed as his ear slowly peeled away from his skull. He stared helpless at the lump of flesh, pinched in fingers he could no longer control. Does it bounce, do you think? Asked the dragon, as William involuntarily threw his detached ear at the table. It does! Wonderful! I need... William breathed. To stop insulting the creature who was only keeping you alive for his own amusement? I agree. He tried to stand, but his legs refused to obey. He tried to reach out and throw the bone out the window, but didn't even manage to lift his finger. William swallowed in a dry throat, resigned to his fate. What do you want? He asked. Oh, Willie boy, we're just getting started. A crash came from William's study. One by one, he watched as his treasured collection rolled, clattered, and crawled its way into the dining room. The bits and pieces of bone and stone combined together into a grotesque mockery of William himself. The collection moved forward and pulled him by his feet to his collar. To his feet by his collar, sorry about that. In 1,000 dead, hollow voices, it shrieked at him. Suddenly it went dark, and William was surrounded with the stench of rotting meat, bile, and just a hint of sulfur. He managed to turn his head to see the shadow of an enormous teeth clamped shut in front of his eyes, and he wept. "Have you been naughty, sweetie?" asked a woman's voice from outside the darkness. William didn't know how long he'd been here, but the voice sounded oddly familiar. "He started it," the dragon replied. "Well, yes, but he's an idiot, whereas you are very wise. Isn't that how we came to our arrangement?" The voice grumbled and growled. "That was a long time ago. Things change," it said. The woman's tone was gentle and soothing. "Come back with me, darling. Leave this fool to his misery." "I don't want to. I have plans for this one." "Don't make me banish you," the woman teased. The dragon growled. "You got lucky first time, witch," it said, but the fight was out of it. "Maybe, but once was all it took." William opened his eyes. He was sat at his table, his head down. He lifted his head and grasped at the scab at the side of his skull. It peeled away, still stuck to the table. Across from him, holding the dragon bone fragment, sat the woman from the churchyard. She smiled at William. "I did warn you, dear," she said, sweetly. You did all of this, didn't you?" William jumped up, pushing his chair to the floor, and was about to dive at the woman when he froze. Gripped in the woman's other hand was the hilt of a sword, which had a blade so impossibly thin as to be nearly unseen, the tip of which was pressed lightly, but assuredly, against William's throat. "He really is a git, isn't he?" the woman asked. "It's almost impressive," the dragon replied. "I'm keeping his ear, just so you know." The woman withdrew and somehow hid the blade with a flick of her wrist. William staggered backwards, falling over his own chair. "Suits me," the woman said, smiling again. She tilted her head to one side. "Well, darling, maybe this will teach you a lesson, and I would get that wound looked at if I were you." She leaned forward, putting her hand up to her mouth. "It's starting to smell," she whispered. And with that, she turned and left. The next day, William stood in the churchyard once again, a bandage wrapped around his head. He paced up and down the graves and tombs, one after the other, trying to make sense of everything that had happened, gibbering to himself about kidnappers and hidden spaces. Unseen, a few graves over, a woman and dragon watched. The woman shook her head in disappointment, and scratched the dragon under the chin, shrugged at it, and smiled as they both faded into the mist. Okay. Sip of coffee, I think. How's everybody doing, by the way? Coffee. I do love coffee. Let's see here. The next one we have is titled Don't Look. It's a personal favorite of mine. The streets were a dangerous place, it seemed. Oh, 1 second. I need to just adjust that. There we go. I'll start again. The streets were a dangerous place, it seemed. Every day, Michael heard of a new mugging or robbery, a new rape or murder in the alleys and streets that he frequented. Looking around tonight, half drunk and amused, Michael wandered between the local bars. He turned down a street and narrowly avoided running into a man who stood in the middle of the sidewalk. Instead, he sidestepped into a signpost. Michael picked himself up off the ground, with effort, his alcohol consumption finally making itself known, and turned towards the man he had almost ran down. He was about to scream at him, but something in the man's face made him pause. The man wasn't looking at him. He was looking unblinkingly over Michael's shoulder. The stranger's eyes were red-rimmed. They twitched with the effort of remaining open, and they were absolutely filled with terror. Curiosity getting the better of him, Michael tried to turn to see what the stranger was looking at. Then the man's hand was around Michael's throat. The stranger pulled him close to his chest, the scent of his unwashed body filling Michael's senses. The man's chapped lips brushed against Michael's ear as he whispered in a half-maddened tone, "Don't look behind you." Michael pried the stranger's hand from his throat and stepped away. "The hell is wrong with you?" he screamed. But again, the stranger wasn't looking at him. "Don't worry. You aren't in any danger. Not yet, at least. You'll be fine, just for the love of all that you hold dear, don't look behind you." Michael paused, looking over the stranger. His eyes were fixed. His jaw was set. He was serious. Michael swiveled his eyes to look at his side, trying to catch sight of whatever's behind him in his periphery, but it was of no use. He stood there for several moments, unsure of what to do. "If I move, he'll attack me again. But what's to stop him if I stay?" He tried once more to turn his head. At the corner of his eye, he could have swore he saw a strange, clawed arm. Then the stranger's hand turned Michael's head back once again. "Don't," he said, simply. While Michael debated with himself, the stranger cleared his throat. He rubbed his stubbled chin with a dirty, scarred hand, and then began to speak, as if he had been asked. "I knew a boy once, and he was scared. Scared of the dark, scared of loud noises, scared of small creatures and great. Most of all, he was scared of what was hiding under the bed. He knew, as only children know, that there was something other under the bed, patiently waiting for him to make a mistake. He dare not leave his feet uncovered, nor would he lay with his hands over the edge of the mattress. But what he couldn't resist was sleep. Oh, how he struggled against sleep. For whenever he closed his eyes, he could hear gentle breathing from beneath the bed like the ebb and flow of ocean waves. For months, he dreaded the ritual of bedtime, hated brushing his teeth, despised his nightly bath, couldn't hear the words good night. Until, one night, perhaps driven mad by exhaustion or driven to bravery by soul-gripping terror, he decided he'd had enough. He was going to meet the creature under the bed. Michael was awestruck. He was half drunk, slightly bruised, and being told a bedtime story by a madman. And yet, he wanted to know more. The night was warm and comfortable. Street lights illuminated his blinds, filling the room with a faint, gentle glow. The boy lay in his bed, nervous, excited, biding his time. He waited until his eyes adjusted to the gloom, and then began to breathe in a long, gentle rhythm. He struggled at first to maintain his pace, his excitement getting the best of him, but he refused to give up. Time passed. The boy's breathing slowed, his eyes closed, and at the very moment of Morpheus's triumph, a subtle noise emanated from under the bed, the slow hiss of the creature. Scrapes and muffled echoes of movement greeted the boy, who dared not open his eyes. He heard it crawl out from the bed. The air moved around him, and he felt the hair on his neck stand at attention. He lay limp, while his mattress shifted with the weight of the creature from under the bed. As it stood on too many limbs, straddling the boy, trapping him in place. He felt its hot, stinging breath upon his cheek. Sharp shards of hair brushed against his face as it rhythmically sniffed the air. Suddenly, the creature jumped off the bed and landed on the floor with a thud. The boy threw off his blankets and searched for it, but only caught a glimpse of a claw-like leg as it vanished into the shadow below the bed. Regretfully, the boy gave chase. He rolled from his bed and belly-crawled after the creature. Walls and warm carpet gave way to cold, damp stone, barely high enough to pass through. But he pressed on. He heard the creature in the distance, its hands slapping against the stone, its legs scraping along and pushing it forward. It shrieked in a voice like cold steel. The boy was gaining on it, grasping at the darkness ahead of him. Finally, the air changed. The echo wasn't quite so close. The air was colder. There was open space around him. He listened intently for the creature, but all he could hear was his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then, far above, a bright light shone over the edge of a great cliff. Blinking back tears, the boy realized that this was no cavern or pit. It was a canyon, and he had emerged at the bottom of it. There, across the gray stone canyon floor, something shuddered and began to take shape. By the light of the moon, the boy finally saw the creature as it unfolded into its full height. Here the stranger paused, and for the briefest of moments his eyes lost the ghastly stare they held in perpetuity. My dear friend, there are things in existence that were never intended to be witnessed by the human eye. Things so alien, so bizarre, that the mind struggles to grasp for comparison. Failing comprehension, the witness slowly goes insane as the mind attempts to bury the memory of what it couldn't have seen by inventing lesser horrors. What I can tell you with certainty is that the boy saw a thing which was unafraid, and which seemed to smile at him. The boy left that place, but he did not hurry. He felt no fear of the darkness ahead as he blindly crawled through it, nor any trepidation of what it could contain. He held no terror of the creature any longer, although he heard it scurrying close behind, patiently waiting when the boy sometimes lost his way. It no longer hid itself from the boy. It had no reason to. The boy crawled out from the darkness under his bed and carefully rolled between the covers. He didn't react when he felt something cold and clammy crawl into bed with him. He even took comfort from the soft hiss that filled the air and the gentle touch of the creature as it stroked his hair with its ragged limbs. In the morning, the boy awoke alone. The creature was nowhere to be seen. In a daze, unsure of what was real or nightmare, the boy went out into the dining room. His mother sat at the table, eating a simple breakfast. She looked up and smiled at him and said good morning, but the boy did not respond. He didn't even look at her. He was too busy looking behind her at the multi-jointed arm that went to a mouth, one of many, connected to a horror too real to exist. Quietly, it hissed, "Shh." Michael watched the stranger's eyes. There, right in the pit of them, he thought he saw teeth flashing in the streetlight. The stranger swallowed in a dry throat, and continued. Time passed, but the creature became the boy's constant companion, always out of sight to anyone but him. Try as he might, tell who he might, Nobody believed his ramblings, his story about his journey beneath the bed, nor that he could see the creature. But now, my dear friend, I have told you. You can believe it or not, as you will. But please, for your own sake. The stranger turned his eyes and, for the first time, met Michael's. With an absolute pleading in his voice, he continued, "Don't look behind you." And with that, the stranger turned on his heels and slowly walked away. Michael waited there for several minutes, unsure of what to do. Then, feeling silly, he turned and went home. He arrived feeling ill at ease from his dealings with the stranger. The man was mad, that much was obvious, but Michael couldn't help but wonder at him. What kind of world would it be, he thought, to believe all of that, and to know with absolute certainty that it was real? To see what watched from behind people, and what lived under the bed. He got undressed and walked across the room to his bed, but he stopped mid-step. He turned to the mirror which sat above his dresser and stared at it, looking for what he knew couldn't possibly be there. He watched for several minutes while his heart pounded and every hair in his body stood on end. He had thought that, just for an instant, something had been watching him. Something that wanted to look like him, like his reflection, but had no humanity in its eyes or movements. And its teeth. Oh, its teeth. He shook his head to dislodge the sudden urge he felt to run. Then he took a deep breath and crawled beneath the sheets. As minutes turned to hours, and he lay there still, unmoving but awake, he heard the faintest scratchings coming from underneath his bed. Rats, he thought, as the scratching turned to a soft, rhythmic breathing. Very big rats. Even as he justified it to himself, and as a great many limbs curled around him in an embrace, he remembered the look in the crazed stranger's eyes, and the advice he had given him. Don't look. Always liked that story. Always nice to talk about what could be under the bed, because it's such a common fear. Okay. Now, the next one is called In an Instant. He looked through his window and out onto the city. It was raining. It was always raining. Living in Seattle, it seemed to do little else. He sighed. The rain was fitting, he thought. It should be raining on a night like this. He glanced down to the pistol in his hand, felt the weight of it, along with the weight of his intention. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. A loud crunch came from behind him. He turned to see a strange girl sitting on his sofa. She was loudly eating from a bag of popcorn. She took another great handful of fluffy kernels and attempted to shove them into her mouth, more missing than succeeding. "How did you get in here?" he asked, putting the gun behind his back reflexively. "Aw, it was just getting to the good part," the girl replied, setting the bag down and licking her fingers and palm haphazardly. She looked over to the white wall next to the man. "It always makes such fun patterns on white. Maybe it's the contrast." "What?" She smiled. "The blood, silly. Well, and brains, of course. Oh, and tiny bits of skull." She squished her face into a look of mock disgust. "I always wonder if the brains know when they hit the wall. What do you think?" She turned to the man once again. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" the man asked, tucking the gun into his belt behind his back. Oh, don't hide it. If you hide it, you'll never get to the good part. She tried to pout, but her lip refused to cooperate. She attempted to glare at her own lip and tried again. Finally, she succeeded, forcing her lower lip out on the third try and with some assistance from her hand. She pointed to the lip with pride and gave a thumbs up to the man, who stared in astonishment. The man blinked at her. The girl stirred on his couch, uncomfortably, looking at the floor and ceiling, avoiding his gaze. Finally, she cleared her throat, sat straight up, and raised her hand high, straining against gravity, staring at him in a perfect facsimile of seriousness. The man furrowed his brow at her, but shrugged and said, "Yes." What was your question again? Which one? She shrugged. Which one do you want answered? How did you get in here? The girl smiled. That's a stupid question. Honestly, given the choice, I would have asked for the meaning of life or how to get $10 million by tomorrow without getting arrested. No wonder you want to kill yourself. She rolled her eyes at him. Anyway, I got in the same way I go anywhere. It's not funny, the man said, his voice cold. What's not? You don't joke about suicide. Who's joking? It's not a prop gun in your belt, is it? She leaned as far as she could while still sitting cross-legged on his couch and trying to peer behind his back. He turned to hide the pistol better. She fell to her side, legs still crossed, but now dangling in midair. Totally real, she said, half muffled by the fabric of the cushion. That's not the point. You don't make fun of things like that, he chided. The girl righted herself. Her hair, tied horizontally on both sides of her head, flopped with emotion. What? Who says? Seems like a silly rule to me. Just people, okay? It's not something people do. The man let out an exasperated sigh. The girl blinked at him. That's a stupid rule. You're stupid. You should kill yourself. She smiled in triumph. When the man didn't say anything, she continued. See? Because I made fun of it, and I'm people. Well, kind of. More or less. So I win. The man clenched and unclenched his jaw. Get out, he said, simply. Don't wanna. You're fun. She picked a piece of fallen popcorn from her shirt and threw it at him. It bounced off his face. Besides, you need me. I need you? He replied, incredulous. I'm having the worst night of my life, and you're making fun of it. Why the fuck would I need you? The girl stood up and smiled. Because it isn't over yet, she said. What? Your life. The bullet's still in the gun, so it isn't over yet. That's how cause and effect works. Well, usually. Most of the time, anyway. He shook his head. None of this makes sense, he said. It's suicide. Not making sense is par for the course. The girl strolled over to him, reached her arms out, and hugged him. What are you doing? He asked uncomfortably. I thought you might need a hug. Isn't that something people do? Wish they could have been there to hug them? I don't know, he said sadly. I'm also stealing this, she said quickly, pulling away and taking his pistol with her. Hey! He reached out to grab her, but she spun out of his grasp. Be careful with that! It's loaded! The girl rolled her eyes at him once again. Well, duh. Hard to kill yourself with an empty gun. She twirled the gun on her finger, expertly, then held the barrel to her nose and inhaled deeply. I love that smell. Don't you? What smell? He replied, annoyed. Gunpowder. The rain pounded into the windows around them. In the distance, rolling in the bay, thunder echoed. What? I haven't fired that gun in years. The girl smiled at him mischievously. Want a bet? She held the gun to her head, her smile frozen on her face. Then she jerked her head to the side in mimicry. He jumped. She laughed and pointed at him. Your face! You should have seen your face! She doubled over, clutching her stomach, still laughing. She glanced up again through her bangs, then laughed harder. Seriously, do you have a mirror? It's so good. So, he started. Shush! She ran over to him and placed her finger on his lips. Wait, you can almost... Thunder shook the windows in their frames, sending them both to the ground, covering their ears. She rolled to her side, still holding her hands on her head, laughing. There! See? What the hell was that? She rolled to her knees and poked him in the side of the skull. The pain seemed to stay there, burning in. The gun, silly. It finally went off. You're on your way! Isn't this exciting? The gun. But the gun is... He looked around for the pistol. It had fallen to the floor during the thunder. What are you talking about? The pain in the side of his head grew. It felt as if a bug was biting him, tunneling into his skull. You'll figure it out, she said, still smiling. In the meantime, she jumped up and ran to the couch, where she plopped down and grabbed the bag of popcorn once again. She threw a handful in the general direction of her mouth, missing with every kernel but one. She munched down on the other, and as the others landed around her. Let me know when you feel it coming out the other side, she said between chews. I don't want to miss anything. So, wait. I'm dying? Well, sure. Unless you can survive a bullet to the brain. She furrowed her brow. You wouldn't do that to me, would you? Not after all this effort. She pulled her lower lip once again and pointed at it, accusingly. I'll try not to, he finished. The girl squealed. Awesome! I love the splash and the sound when the skull splits open. Oh, it's so good. You're crazy, he said. The girl shook her head. Which one of us just shot themselves? Be careful who you're calling crazy. That's different, he protested. I had reasons to do what I did. You're just being cruel. Am not. How are you not? You're making this worse at every turn. Nuh-uh. You haven't even thought of why you did it since you pulled the trigger, have you? Not like you were before I showed up. Well, yeah, but that's not... Ta-da! She bowed from her sitting position on the sofa. And you're welcome, by the way. So you're some kind of consolation prize, keeping me company while I die? Well, sure, if you like. But is that what you are? No, not even a little. She tilted the bag towards him. Popcorn? The man stood there, the pain in his head progressing steadily. My brain itches, he said finally. How is that even possible? It isn't. It can't. Your brain can't feel anything. You're just imagining it. He pulled a chair out from the table and sat backwards in it, facing her, leaning on the back. It doesn't feel like I'm imagining it. She shrugged. Good imagination? Nah, I couldn't even imagine my way out of my problems. He sighed. I thought you said people shouldn't joke about suicide, she teased. He glared at her in response. Oh, come on. You've got a few minutes left at max. Do you really want to spend it dwelling on why you killed yourself? He laughed through his nose and smiled. I guess not. The girl brought her knees up to her chin and rested her head on them. So, what's it like? I mean, you said it itches. What else? Actually, since you mentioned that it couldn't, it kinda went away. The girl visibly deflated. Well, that's boring. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. I'm bored now. What, you want me to die quicker? She perked up. Could you? Shut up. He could feel pressure beginning to build on the other side of his head, near what would be the exit wound. He shivered at the thought. Do you think anyone will miss me? He asked, finally. The girl stared at him. You really are stupid, aren't you? She replied. I mean, I know, shot yourself, I should have known, but seriously. She shook her head. His face fell. Of course, people will miss you, she finished. He looked up again. You think so? Well, sure. For a little while, anyway. A couple of years, maybe. A decade for people you were really close to. They'll all beat themselves up with how they wish they could have stopped you or how they could have seen it coming and all that. But eventually, everyone will move on with their lives and forget about you. Everyone. What? Well, what did you expect? People to pine over you and weep at your grave for the rest of their lives? He shrugged. I, I don't know. I guess I thought I was a little more important than that. She giggled to herself. Nope. But don't worry about it. Nobody is. People are built to cope and survive. She looked at the hole in the side of his head. Most people, she corrected herself. The pressure in the side of his head turned into a burning ache. He closed his eyes to try to focus on something other than the pain. It started out the other side, hasn't it? He nodded. Things will move quickly now. It'll all be over soon. She reached out and put a hand on his shoulder. Is there anything you want to say before you go? I can't think of anything. He struggled to get the words out. Hey, you wanted this, remember? Yeah, but I didn't know it would hurt this much. He gasped. The girl laughed. Why does nobody ever think it'll hurt? She stood up and walked him to the window. Then she went and sat down. She leaned back into the sofa and grabbed her bag of popcorn. It's time. Are you ready? He didn't open his eyes, but he nodded. As the girl watched, his skull separated. Blood, bone, and brain sprayed in a crimson dance through the air. She applauded as it struck a perfectly white wall in a Rorschach chart of gore. Smiling, she walked up to the mess as the body began to fall. She picked up a little piece of brain and poked it, gently. It wobbled in her palm. Hey, mister, she whispered. Could you feel the wall? The piece of brain didn't reply. The girl smiled. I hope you got what you wanted, she said. Then she kissed the bit of gray matter, set it back in the pile, and walked away. The gun went off like a jolt of thunder. In an instant, he was dead. That's always well, I can't say it's a fun one, but it's an interesting one. I actually wrote that in response to a lot of literature that came out in the last several years that are really kind of aiming to glorify suicide, which having known so many people that killed themselves, that's not something that sat right with me. And so I kind of wanted to write something that was, at least for me, a little more on the honest side when it came to things like that. I mean, it's gonna be different for everybody, but I mean, it is what it is. So more coffee, I think, and then we're gonna move on to our final story for the day. Okay, so this one is from my very, very first book, which was called A Glimpse into Madness. It was unillustrated, so you guys get the cover. And it's titled A Letter to a Friend. When we were young, we would play in the fields behind my house. The grass and wild wheat would be as tall as we were, and we'd play hide and seek. I remember thinking I was clever, because I would leap into the field instead of running, making my trail harder to follow. But you always found me. In the spring, we would chase butterflies and pretend we could fly along with them, and in the evening, we would stand very still and wait for them to get tired. They would land on us. Do you remember? You got so scared and kept asking how such a beautiful creature could have such a terrifying face. I never let you live it down. When we were older and the other boys would pick on us, We would always fight back together. It was always the two of us. You are my best friend and my confidant. Can you imagine my surprise when they told me you didn't exist? You were there, remember? The doctor said I was making you up, that you were all in my head. How could I have taken on all those other boys then? Did I play hide and seek by myself? Am I really that crazy? I know you said they were lying, but I wasn't sure. I had to find out, you know? Do you understand? The day I started taking the pills from the doctor, you told me not to. You were worried about what they could do to me, to us. It turns out you were right to be worried. First, you got sick, and you couldn't get out of bed in the morning. That didn't stop us, though. You'd been sick before. But I hadn't realized up until then that it had always been when I was sick, too. We played cards and board games all day. Soon, you were able to get out of bed, but you were angry with me. You were so easy to offend then. I never did figure out why. Did you know what was happening to you? Did you blame me? I remember the last day. I got out of bed in the morning, but I couldn't find you anywhere. I searched the entire house. I even asked my mom if she had seen you, but she just shook her head, sadly. I was alone all day. I got so worried about you that I didn't take my pills, and that night, when I was just dozing off to sleep, I heard you. You were coughing on the floor. I rushed to your side, asked you what happened, why you were so sick, what I could do, but you only smiled at me. You kept saying you were cold, in the end. I cuddled up next to you, rubbed your shoulders, your arms, tried to warm you up, but you only got colder. Finally, I went to get my electric blanket from the bed, and when I turned around, you were gone. Only the cold floor looked back at me. I cried all night, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have you there to comfort me. Months have passed since that night. Now, when the other boys pick on me, I don't always have the courage to fight back. But sometimes I remember you and fight twice as hard. Yesterday, I went into the field behind my house and brought a shovel. I dug you a proper grave and buried a box to represent you. I even found a big rock for a headstone. In the evening, the butterflies came and rested on your grave mound, and for once, you weren't afraid of their faces. I held still for hours, but the butterflies won't come back to me anymore. Okay, and that is going to be the end of this reading stream for everybody. So I hope you guys had fun. If you guys want to check out the artist and her website, that is right there on the screen for you in chat. If you want to check out the book info, that is right there. And if you ever want to hit up and follow any of the other things on the Discord or anything like that, it's kind of where I keep everybody informed on what's going on with the stream. Go ahead and follow any of those. But we are going to be doing another reading stream probably in a couple of weeks. I kind of want to get feedback on this, see what people liked, what people hated, all that fun stuff, and kind of go from there. But we do have another one coming up, and we are going to be streaming. Let's see, we're going to be streaming more Dragon Age on Monday. I would like to stream something else tomorrow because I have had very little internet this week due to all the fires and the heat in my area. So I'd like to catch up if I can, but hopefully you guys join me for that. But I have been LeftToeDjinn. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the stories. I've enjoyed reading them to you. I'll see you next time. Have an excellent day. Bye-bye.